Hey, my name's TC Burr. Welcome to Yet, a podcast created to encourage you to get your goal or idea out of your head and into reality. On this podcast, you'll hear stories, encouragements, tips, and ideas to help you write your book, start your business, launch your podcast, or whatever it is you hope to accomplish. Because it's not that you haven't done it, it's just that you haven't done it yet. My guest today is Suzy Langevin. Suzy, how are you?
I'm doing well, TC. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking. So thank you so much for joining the show. One of the things that I love to do to start off on these interviews is I always like to encourage my guests to introduce themselves. And so if you don't mind, would you please tell folks in 30 to 60 seconds a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So I am a romance author. I have been writing most of my life, but recently, within the last 2 or 3 years, I've really transitioned into this place of I want to write the stories that I want to read. And those are the stories that include happy ever afters for everybody, regardless of the things that they're struggling with. In my professional life, I am trained as a clinical social worker. So I am also a huge advocate of mental health and the accurate and empathetic portrayal of mental health through the lens of all of the different ways that that shows up in people's lives and really creating spaces, places, and characters who are worthy of love.
Awesome. I love that. So you said you've been writing basically your whole life, it sounds like, but there's been a recent shift to, I think you described it as the stories that you want to read. Talk a little bit about that shift. What were you doing before that? And was there like kind of a catalyst moment that made you shift gears, or talk a little bit about that journey?
Absolutely. So the first thing I remember as a writer is when I was in elementary school, our local newspaper had this section of the paper called Happy Times. And literally, it was for school kids in the city that I grew up in to send in poems and like little snippets of essays that they would then publish in the Sunday paper. And so you would get a certificate in the mail. It was like a whole big deal if your stuff went into Happy Times in the paper. And I had over the years like several poems and pieces that I had written that were featured in this part of the newspaper. And so that was always something that stuck with me is like the written word has power. This is a place where you can get your ideas out there. This is a place where people listen to what you have to say. And so that was my first experience with sort of being published, if we want to call it that. And that was the spark of that I think I've carried with me my whole life. But when I went to college, I majored in English literature, which was a fantastic education, learned a ton about communication in writing and all of that great stuff. But it also made me really self-conscious about the idea that if you're going to write, it should be to say something really important. You know, you're sitting there and you're reading James Joyce and the Brontes and all of these really canonical figures really in Western literature. And so you think about like, if I'm going to write, I better have something to say. And it always felt like there was never anything that rose to that level of importance. So I wrote a lot of poetry over the years, but never really pursued the idea of publishing or anything like that because of that fear, because of that roadblock. And then during the pandemic, as I think happened to a lot of people, we're kind of reevaluating what are the things that are important to us. And I realized that I didn't have to be ashamed of just liking things because I liked them, because they made me feel good, because the idea of a happy ending and the assured happy ending at the end of a romance novel was something that was really comforting and really welcome in the chaos of the pandemic and everything that was going on from 2020 to now. And so the more I got comfortable with saying, you know what, the like reading part of my life doesn't have to be serious. It was sort of, what if the writing part of my life didn't have to be serious in that way either? What if I could write the kinds of things that I like to read? And as I got into it more and more, and as I was spending more time kind of honing craft and getting into the process of creating, it became an avenue to tell the stories about the important stuff within the context of something that has a pretty well-defined structure. If you're somebody who reads a lot of romance novels, they sort of follow a pattern of predictable beats. And once you're able to figure out how to work within those structures, it opens up to be able to talk about the stuff that feels important, to talk about mental health, to talk about how do you break cycles of, family dysfunction, and how do you make life better for yourself than where you came from. But you do it all through this lens of the love story. And it was a really sort of revelatory experience for me that it's okay to tell just a love story, because you're also going to tell something so much bigger and broader that connects to tons of elements of the human experience through the lens of falling in love.
Yeah, I love that. So it's funny to hear you describe it as just a love story, because as you're saying that, the thing that keeps coming to mind for me is like that idea, that concept of love is something that's universally understood. Like people long for it, everyone wants it. When you have it, like it's just kind of, and it's not limited to a time period or a culture or a type of person. Like it's one of those things that connects to, I think, all of us, and using that as a vehicle to get to some of these other issues and these other topics that you want to delve into, I think is genius. And you're right, like why not write the stuff that you like to read? Because you as a reader are evidence that people like to read this stuff. So of course
Absolutely.
it makes a ton of sense. And I imagine it's way more fun for you too, right? Like you're in the
Absolutely.
world that you already enjoy, that you're already used to. And so I think that's really cool. So, okay, so you've talked about kind of that first initial hurdle or roadblock of feeling like if I don't have something, earth shattering important to say, then I better not say anything. And you overcame that one. What are some of the other, like, so once you got past that one and started with the writing process, what are some of the other challenges that you've had to overcome along the way?
I think anybody who will tell you that they are coming to writing as a second avocation, if you will, in their life is the time factor.
Mm.
I am a full-time professional. I work as a social worker during the day. I have 2 kids, so the constant sort of upstream that you're fighting with working with the family schedule and all those kinds of things. So finding the time and the space for the things that you want to do in a creative realm can be really challenging. And I think finding the places and spaces where you can sort of do it on the fly, or getting good at like capturing just minutes or pieces of that time. There's actually a really well-known internet challenge that sort of pushes people to think about, can you draft a novel in the space of 1 month?
Mm.
And so my first book that is coming out actually was originally drafted as part of that process. And so it's literally just about carve out time for the period of 1 month to just get the words on the page. Can you write 50,000 words in a month? And even though the finished product ended up being longer than that, that was my initial starting point for, you know what, I can carve out time for this. I can find a space for this. And there's some really interesting and creative ways people get into that. I myself write a lot on my phone. I use like Google Drive as the place where most of my work in progress lives. So I can type stuff on my phone while I'm sitting in the car outside the dance studio waiting for my daughter to finish class.
Yeah.
I have other authors that I know who use a lot of voice to text, so they will speak their work as they're driving or doing things like that. So that one's never worked so well for me. I'm much more a typing kind of person, but finding those just minutes or snatches of, you know what, I've got 15 minutes instead of mindlessly scrolling on Instagram, maybe I'll try and get some words out. And are they
Mm.
the next great American novel in their first pass through on my phone? Probably not. But just the roadblock of getting it out there, I think, can be a tough one to overcome. And just getting something out on the page is a great place to start.
That's great. I think a lot of people, so I've got an episode coming up actually where I talk about some of the things you just shared about capturing your ideas, in different ways, whether it's on your phone or voice app or whatever. And I love your perspective of kind of grabbing those little pieces of time when you have them. I call that the hidden time, right? Like, so I think a lot of us think that if I'm going to do anything meaningful, I've got to have 2 hours clear where I can sit down and get my coffee cup and be in the zone, no distraction. But like, that's not real life oftentimes. Like you can get those for sure. And I think you can and should probably fight to schedule those. But like more often than not, it is like, hey, I've got 15 minutes before my next meeting, or I've got to, I'm standing in line at the grocery store or something like that. And you can actually make a lot of progress in those moments if you're intentional about it. And if you're, so I love that, especially for those of us who have jobs and families and other things, like everyone has things kind of demanding their time, but depending on the season of life that you're in and kind of what your circumstance is, you may have more or less of that time, but everybody has those hidden moments. So I think that's great perspective. What other ideas or tips would you have for someone who is thinking about starting off? They've got an idea for a book, but they haven't really made much progress, and they feel like I can't. Maybe they feel like their idea isn't good enough. Maybe they feel like there's not enough time in the day or whatever. Like, are there other things that you've learned along your journey that have been super helpful for you, or tools that you've leveraged that you feel like this is one that you would recommend, or what are some of those things for you?
I think the first thing as a writer is to read. That when you get stuck, when it feels like, I don't know quite how to turn this into the place where I want it to go, it's picking up a book and seeing how other people do it. Reading extensively within whatever genre that you write to understand the conventions, the beats, the pieces of that as you go, but also picking up and reading from other genres that are not the place that you usually operate from, to get a different sense of perspective and a different place to approach kind of the craft of storytelling. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, is remembering I'm not just writing a book. That's the end product, right? Is the book, but I'm telling a story. And so, what is it about the story that is meaningful? What is it about the journey that's meaningful? In my day to day life, I do a lot of training, and I tell people all the time, data doesn't change people's minds. If you want to sit there and give people graphs and numbers, that's great. It's good information to have, but you're not going to change anybody's mind by giving them facts and figures. You're going to change somebody's mind by giving them stories. You're going to change somebody's mind by changing their heart. And so, as a storyteller at our core, I think that's what it's really about, is how do I break through the minutia or the drudgery, if you will, of the plot and get to the point? How do you get to the story, to what you want to tell? And if you can work backwards from there and know what your end position is, I think that can be really important. The other piece is sometimes your characters are going to do things that you don't expect them to do. And I know that you think you're the writer, you think you're in charge, and sometimes it does not quite go that way. So being open to letting things unfold in an organic process and listening when that voice inside you says we're going in a different direction, when they take on a life of their own in your brain, that can be a really rewarding process to follow. I always say that I start all of my stories with a what if, and that's sort of the jumping off point is, well, what if we took this element and put it in this place? What would happen if that was sort of the crucible that came together? And letting yourself just kind of go wild. You can always edit later, you can always break it apart and put it back together, but you can't edit an empty page. So just getting into the what is the story you want to tell, and you can work out the mechanics of it later.
Love it. So going on that idea of kind of letting the story go where it's going to go, I'm curious, for your first drafts specifically, are you somebody who likes to plot things out, or you just kind of start writing and see, like, where do you fall on that spectrum of, like, because some people are super detailed and I've got to have every plot point. Others, I kind of lend more toward this side where I just like, let me just get my fingers on the keys and see what happens. I'll clean it up later. Like,
Yep.
Sounds like maybe you might be more in that camp, but I'm curious if you could describe your process there.
I'm laughing because I refer to myself as a reformed pantser. So they
Nice.
oftentimes talk in writing communities, are you a plotter or are you a pantser, meaning are you an
Yeah.
outliner or are you a person that just goes after it and what happens happens? And for a very long time, that was my writing style, is I have a blank document and a dream and let's see where it takes us. As
Yeah.
I've gotten more into realm of looking at being traditionally published, there are genre conventions, there's things to follow within those places that are actually really interesting, like guardrails, because once you have the guardrails, you can innovate within them. So there's a whole different process to that. So I was very fortunate that earlier this year I was selected to be a part of a mentorship program. And I've been working with an established published romance author on a manuscript of mine. And she has been encouraging me gently along the way to think about, like, how do you use outlining in a different way to get your brain wrapped around where you want something to go, especially since the book that we're working on is the first book in a series. So
Okay.
you want to have your Bible, so to speak, ready to go to keep all track of all your details. And there's pieces of that process that have been really, really helpful, just in terms of getting a sense of, I know what the rhythm of the story is going to be, and then I can play around more within the actual scene planning that happens there. So I'm slowly working towards slightly more structure to my process, but at the end of the day, the ADHD chaos that lives in my brain is always just going to want a blank page, and away we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's funny. So this show is intended for people who have an idea or a goal, or like writing a book, something big. Doesn't have to be a book, but for a lot of people it will be writing a book. And I've come to believe that one of the most critical ingredients to writing something or really creating anything great is encouragement, because a lot of people that I've brought on this show have talked to me about, self-doubt or imposter syndrome or feeling like their work isn't good enough. And it's often like in those moments when you get someone close to you kind of give you a word of encouragement or do something for you that really kind of just shows that they're in your corner, that can really make the difference between, creating something amazing or just throwing in the towel. I'm curious, from your perspective, do you have any examples of maybe a word that someone's offered or something that someone's done for you that you would point to and say, man, that was such an encouraging moment in my journey? I'd love if you would share an example if you have one.
That's a great question. But I would say, first and foremost, in trying to find the time or the spaces for this, I'm very fortunate that my husband is incredibly supportive of the work that I do. And so when I have been trying to do something audacious, like write 50,000 words of a novel in a month, he's supportive of that process and really does what he can to help make that happen for me. In terms of one story or one snippet, though, I think about I have a cousin that I'm very close with. We grew up kind of down the street from each other, so it's more like a sister than a cousin. But she is also somebody who's a huge romance novel fan. And so finding somebody who was in that same lane, who enjoys the same things I do, that could be like a first step alpha reader, if you will, for some of what I was working on, just for kind of like the proof of concept of,
Yeah.
does this even feel like something that's appealing? And I just remember she was reading one of my manuscripts and just was sending me text messages that were nothing but like punctuation and emojis as she was going through and reading it. If what I put on a page can inspire somebody enough to be speechless, or at least, speaking only in kind of code with emojis and punctuation, I know I've got something here. And so
Yeah.
having that kind of person who is supportive and also gets the world that I'm working in, I think was so super important. My husband is great. He doesn't read a lot of romance novels, so he doesn't have a great sense of like what might be marketable. So having somebody who is both somebody you care about, who cares about you, and then also knows this world that you're trying to step into, I think was super, super helpful.
Yeah, that's great. That's cool that she is kind of like you said, she's already in that world. That's her lane as far as reading goes. And so she can give you great feedback, which is amazing.
And she's a librarian by trade, so she spends her life around books, which is great.
Oh, well, there you go. She knows good books then. That's perfect. Speaking of books, are there any books or podcasts or resources that you would recommend that have helped you along your journey? I know a lot of folks that I talk to say, "Oh yeah, if you just read one book on reading, it's this, or here's this great podcast or this great YouTube channel or whatever." I want to connect people with not only stories like yours, but also resources. And one of the best ways I've found to get good resources is to ask other writers, what are you listening to? What are you reading? To try and kind of connect those. So I'm curious, do you have any resources that you would point people to that have helped you?
Absolutely. So if you are a romance writer or have any thought that maybe romance is a genre that you would like to explore, particularly because romance is like the biggest segment of the traditional publishing industry. So if that is a goal of somebody's, is to be traditionally published, having a background or being able to write in that genre can only help you out because it is such a huge piece of kind of the current publishing market space. So there is a book called Romancing the Beat, which is all about understanding the plot structures and expectations of the romance genre. Super short, really easy read. You can kind of almost turn it into like a worksheet or an outline. The author does in the book have this structure of how do you kind of plot out your acts or your beats rather than the whole thing. And for somebody who does best with minimal outlining, I find that structure to be really helpful. But just wrapping your head around this is the general storyline arc that you're looking for in this genre, I think is really incredibly helpful. I'm a firm believer in you can't like break the rules until you know them. So even if you are somebody who wants to play with form and convention, that starts with understanding form and convention. So I think that's a great place to start if you're interested in exploring the romance genre or writing in romance. Similarly, if people are interested in being traditionally published, there's this great podcast called the No One Tells You About Writing. It's put together by an agent. Her name is Suzy Langevin. She's one of the two co-hosts of the podcast. The other one's name is not coming to me. And they look at things like query letters, which is the letter that you send to a prospective agent if you're looking to be traditionally published. And they look at sample pages, which is kind of usually the first step in sending material to an agent. Because I think oftentimes what people don't understand until you get into it, well, I certainly didn't understand until I got into it, is that the business of being a published author bears only a small resemblance to the craft of actually writing a book. So you write the book, and that is oftentimes kind of a solo pursuit in a lot of ways. And once you have this end product, once you've sort of taken it as far as it can go, then you have to figure out how do you move it within this broader industry? How do you know how to find an agent, how to find a publisher? How do you work with the sample materials that you need to pull together to best sell yourself as an author? So it's a completely different skill set than the skill set of just writing the book to begin with. So having that window into how do I position this story that has, taken up so much space in my heart that I've now put on the page, then how do I translate that into the work of actually becoming a published author is such a different game. And understanding that transition, I think, is super helpful if you're interested in getting traditionally published.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Those are great resources. I'll link to those in the show notes. That's perfect. A couple questions and I'll let you get out of here, Suzy. So first, you've talked a little bit about your book. I think you said it's part of a 2-part series and it's coming out relatively soon, right? Talk a little bit about kind of the mechanics of where you are in the publishing journey and maybe a little bit of a preview of what your book's all about.
Absolutely. The publishing process also takes 700 years. So I think that's the other thing I would always advise people who are writing is it's not a fast process. And it's worth taking the time to find the right home for your work and what you are looking to do. So I actually have 2 novels coming out in 2026, one in April, one in July. And they're not necessarily related to each other, but they are both contemporary romance novels. And I actually discovered this publisher through an event on Twitter. I'm going to keep calling it Twitter. I know it goes by a different name now, X, I think.
But, that's what it's called.
It will forever and always be Twitter to this millennial. I'm really sorry. So a lot of organizations will run what they call pitch events on Twitter, where people can put the log line or sort of the 1-sentence pitch for their book. And publishers and agents will read the pitches and decide if they want to see more from you. And so I came across my publisher, Row and Prose Publishing, through a Twitter pitch event. They had liked one of my pitches. I sent them my material, and they liked that. I asked if they wanted to see my second book that I was working on. They liked that too. And so I signed a contract to schedule both of these. But they have been really great to work with. I think a small press publisher, that's the other thing about publishing, is there's a lot of different avenues you can pursue. And I have found that working with a small press publisher has been a really wonderful experience. I know the publisher herself, like we've been talking throughout this process, they've really been helpful with media and marketing and trying to figure out that piece of the process that you're really kind of flying blind with usually as a first-time author. So I've really enjoyed the process of working with a place that's pretty hands-on, pretty small, might not necessarily have the same reach as a big 5 publisher, but the benefits outweigh that of knowing the folks that you're working with and having them feel as passionately about your work as you do. It's like a bit of a process. Like I said, one is coming out in April 2026. The other is coming out in July 2026. But the first, American Royalty, which is coming out in April of 2026, is basically a twist on the Taylor Swift Connor Kennedy romance of 2012,
Okay.
where the son of a prominent senator, which is also, I'm from Massachusetts, so very much modeled on the Kennedy family, falls in love with a pop star, and they break up, and she writes this really savage breakup song about him. And now
Okay.
the staff of his dad's congressional office, including a young woman who is new to the political scene, have to clean up his reputation before his father announces that he's running for president. So the whole kind of background to that book is this young woman who's a congressional staffer falling in love with the son of her boss, and their whole journey together, and the sort of tumultuous union of pop culture and politics, and how all of that comes together for the two of them.
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. Very cool. Well, thanks so much for sharing. I'll include all that information in our notes for this episode. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have just one final question before I let you go, and it's an easy one. Where can people connect with you, follow along with what you're doing, see more about your books? Give me all your links, website, social media, Twitter, wherever you are. How do people
Absolutely.
connect?
Best place to find me is on Instagram. I am at Suzy Langevin Writes. That's probably the place that gets updated the most frequently. Really love to share pictures of coffee and books. So if that is your
Yes.
lane, please come hang out with me on Instagram. I do also have a website where you can sign up for my newsletter, and that is the best way to get information coming straight to you is via that email newsletter. So I'll make sure folks have the link for that. But I'm also on Facebook as well. You can search Suzy Langevin Author, and I'll pop up on there as well to follow along as we get ever closer. Our cover reveals for both books should be coming up just after the first of the year. So excited to see those
Awesome.
come to life with the art and everything that goes along with that.
Yeah, very cool. I can't wait to see it. Well, thank you again so much. This has been great. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great day.
You as well. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you would do me a huge favor, if you got value out of this podcast, which I'm assuming maybe you did since you're still here, would you scroll down to the bottom of your podcast app and rate and review the show? And maybe share it with someone on social media or with a friend, just in a conversation. It would mean so much to get this message out to more people, and I think it would be amazing if you would share it. So that would be, as a personal favor to me, I'd really love it. Also, if you want to know more about me and what I'm working on, you can visit my website. It's tcburr.com. I hope you'll check it out. You can contact me there. Thanks again, and I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.